Americans at least used to enjoy the Pax Americana. The idea of being invested in global security was connected to the idea of American success, prosperity, both psychologically, it was pleasant, but also economically. That's completely broken down. Even the people who still want to do good in the world, because they have a sense of America's mission, and there are lots of people like that, they have zero connection between that and it's good for America. They just have a sense that we should because we're America and we're the good guys.
Welcome to Cambridge Forum, coming to you live via Zoom. I'm Mary Stack, the Executive Director, and today we're focusing on a part of the world that is too important for us to ignore, Russia. Due to its strategic location, its enormous land mass, and its environmental impact, Russia's a country that will always matter. But was it always, though? With the sudden death of Alexei Navalny, Russia's popular opposition leader, Ukraine's recent setbacks in the war, and the coming presidential elections in Russia next week, Putin appears to be riding the crest of a reckless wave of confidence. Is he contemplating a new phase of global aggression, or is his political posturing just more smoke and mirrors? Well, today we're going to consider what's at stake here in this elaborate chess game, and what, if anything, the Western world can do to strengthen the NATO alliance and counter the creeping spread of autocratic regimes. To assist us in understanding the complex political web that Russia is weaving, we've got two superb experts today. Professor Neil McFarland is Professor Emeritus from Oxford University, who's been an international relations and Russia specialist for several decades. He's currently teaching here and associated with the Davis Center at Harvard. Peter Pomerantsev is a senior fellow at Johns Hopkins University, and he's co-director of the Arena Initiative. Peter was born in Kiev, Ukraine, but grew up in the UK, and is author of 3 books on Russian and authoritarian propaganda. His latest is How to Win an Information War, The Propagandists Who Outwitted Hitler. So welcome to you both. Thank you for your time. I know you're very busy, but it's an important topic, so I appreciate it. So let's start with you, Peter. You just returned from Kiev, and you said people there were in survival mode. There's a sense that America is exiting the international stage and that the Ukrainians are trying to process what lies ahead, including capitulation. So perhaps you could expand a little bit about that and tell us what sort of dark sense of foreboding perhaps you experienced when you were there.
Well, firstly, the spirit is always one of grim resolve, not dark foreboding. When you look at existential threats very close up, you weirdly feel kind of calm because the stakes are so obvious. I actually say I have much less anxiety when I'm in Ukraine because the things are clearer, strangely enough. So I'm much more dark foreboding here with the oncoming election. So, but yeah, I think something that comes from a sense of dependence and helplessness, which for all Ukraine's bravery, it is dependent on us, is a sense that people might be doing deals behind your back. And there's a worry that the deal is already being struck, that Trump is already negotiating with Russia and getting ready to sell Ukraine. And then then there's lots of calculations about what could happen after that. One of them is that there might be sort of some sort of push by Russia to offer a more cunning capitulation, not the sort of outright one that they're talking about now, but some sort of deal that will sound okay, but de facto means capitulation.
And from what you've heard, is it talking along the lines of keeping the territory they've got, and creating a new border, or what sort of stuff?
No. The discussion, if America leaves, is whether it's the level of giving up of sovereignty. It's not about territories. It's about, does Ukraine exist as an independent state?
And that wouldn't.
Russia is very open in that it's in its statements. I mean, they don't think Ukraine is a real country. They don't want it to exist, or it can exist on paper, but not in any kind of serious sense.
Despite the fact that they acknowledged it did have sovereignty in 1991, correct?
Yes. Yeah, I mean, yes, you're looking for consistency in Putin. I don't know what to tell you yet. He was saying that he never invaded a few years ago. So
Right.
they're not very consistent, no.
Okay, look, before we look at the roots of that invasion 2 years ago, let's look at Putin's behavior just in the last few weeks. He's been a bit strange. First, we witnessed the terrible death of Alexei Navalny, who Putin really despised, because I think in many ways he was everything Putin isn't. He's smart, he's handsome, he's well-educated, he's articulate, and he was popular, clearly a threat. He also took part in a strange interview with Tucker Carlson, during which time he mentioned Poland 20 times in that interview. So my sense was this a sort of rhetoric, or was this a portent of what he's really thinking about on the back burner after the fall of Ukraine? So, Peter, I'll take your view first, and then I'll go to Neil.
Well, if he's talking about it, that means he's thinking about it. And things which were considered crazy a while ago no longer can be discounted as crazy. I don't know. The Tucker Carlson interview was strange in so many ways. I had actually expected Putin to do all this clever communication with his supporters and potential supporters in the West, and he didn't. He just went on a rant about history, which I don't think any Putin supporters anywhere in America really understood. Which was either a sign that he just doesn't listen to his press guys anymore, and they were probably telling him to do something else. So he might be at that point of sort of alienation from his own advisors, or he was actually trying to make a point, and maybe both. And the point he was trying to make is, I guess, the emissary of Trump has come. I think Putin would see Carlson as a messenger from Trump, from Trump's court, coming, on bended knee to pay respects. And he wiped his feet on him. And it was almost a statement more to Russians. Look, little American has come, and we're now at the stage where I wipe my feet on the next American president's little boy.
Well, it's a pretty good analogy of that.
Again, I have to say I'm speculating. This is me sort of looking at it and trying to work it out. I have not chatted to Putin recently.
But no, you're right. There didn't seem to be any good sense for it. I mean, if you were going to say something important, you wouldn't say it to Tucker Carlson, right?
No, but he could have used the opportunity to talk about culture wars and all these things that resonate really well with some audiences in America and Tucker Carlson's audiences. He could have made a bigger deal out of NATO expansion. He didn't. He just said, look, this is our historic lands and we're taking them back. And then he laughed at Carlson for having applied and failed to join the CIA. I mean, he just sort of humiliated him. So I don't know. He wasn't following the logic that, frankly, I thought that he would follow. But I say.
Okay, Neil, over to you. Welcome. What did you make of that recent events with Putin?
Oh, well, it's pretty bizarre. What can I say? On Navalny, which you started with, I don't think, I think that does have an effect in Russia. I don't think it will have an effect here. Because, I mean, the nature of the media landscape, and I defer to Peter here, in this country, is that you get some weird thing or nasty thing coming up, and 2 days later it's gone, and the focus shifts to something else. So I think it's important to the Russians, but not to the American electorate. Europe may be slightly different. As for portents, I have to say, we don't know what Putin will do next. He is a cipher. I don't think he thinks about Poland. Peter is right. But I don't think he's ready to go there. If he were to win in Ukraine, and I don't think he will, by the way, the next target, if that's what's in his mind, would be the Baltics and not Ukraine. Poland is very well armed. It is a NATO member. It is covered under Article 5, and it's big. And I am, if in a way, one might welcome his attempt to take over Poland, which of course is, taking Peter's phrase, also historical Russian land, or the eastern part, under the tripartite agreement to partition Poland of, I guess, 1795. Sorry. But, what is Russian land anyway? So people are worried about the Baltics, but they're also covered by Article 5. I think we're in a situation with Putin where we need to realistically hope for the best. That is to say that Ukraine won't fall. We should do what we can to ensure that it does not fall, but we should prepare for the worst. And in that case, NATO is already preparing for the worst. There is a major complement of NATO forces, including American forces, in Poland. And there's a substantial reinforcement of NATO forces in Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. Defense spending in NATO is increasing. That will take some time to work its way through. The defense industrial complex is evolving. That will take some time. Time is very important here. We tend to think, with regard to Ukraine, with regard to Putin, we think what's going to happen tomorrow. The EU and NATO are moving reasonably effectively forward in terms of increasing spending and trying to integrate their defense infrastructures. And in the United States, there is also a substantial effort to rekindle the defense industrial complex. So it's really, it's a matter of time. Sorry, go ahead.
Talking about the prospects for Ukraine for the moment, because you seem more optimistic than I expected. I mean, a year ago, America was seriously invested, stressing the importance. I remember Biden walking around with his State of the Union address. It's very important to preserve democracy. This is a kind of a linchpin. If we let this go, it's the beginning of the end. And now we're distracted both with the Gaza situation and our border issues, or at least they're being dangled to distract us. I'm very skeptical that the budget will be passed for what they need in Ukraine.
Well, the budget is one thing. The foreign assistance bill is another thing. It is stalled because of the minority in the House of Representatives. A majority in the House of Representatives supports that bill. And that would be 61 billion for Ukraine in additional military assistance, as well as some for Israel and so on and so forth. I think that, look, I'm an optimist, okay? Always. But I think that the position of the Republican minority in this context is slowly going to become untenable, and they will eventually cave. They will get their kind of border control as a side deal, but I think it's if you think about. Sorry, we're getting into American politics here. We're not supposed to be here, but hey, let's go there. If you think about Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin, they have significant ethnic minority populations, including Ukrainians, Poles, and Balts. This is where this election will likely be decided. And so it would be a remarkable act of self-immolation for the Republicans just to walk away from this and say no. There is a weird fringe out there who says we're not, like Donald Trump, who says not a penny more. But they do not represent the American public as a whole, and I don't think they represent the majority of the Republican Party.
Do you want to add to that or not, Peter?
Oh, you know what? The sun has come out in Washington. It's our first warm spring-like day. I'm going to go with optimistic as well. But we have to also be realistic. We know what's blocking the majority of Republicans doing what they think is right. And that is their presumed nominee, who's, by all accounts and multiple sources, he's the one who's stopping Ukraine aid. And that's become increasingly apparent. It's been blocked for a long time now, by the way, in many months now. And he seems to have a logic. Viktor Orban, the Hungarian prime minister, just visited Mar-a-Lago and says that Trump has a detailed plan for Ukraine. And at the top of that plan is to stop all aid to Ukraine and thus, what he says, force it to negotiate, what we all understand, force it to capitulate. And Trump's son has said this as well in a public talk. He said that is the plan: stop all aid. And yeah, they always use this euphemism, force it to negotiate, but we understand what that really means. Maybe Trump thinks that in return he can then lift sanctions on Russia. Oil price drops, he becomes an economic hero. He may have his own calculation. But there is a force that's stopping the majority of Republicans, who, as Professor McFarlane quite rightly said, would like to pass this bill by all accounts. And they're quite beholden to that force. I'd love to think that this is wrong. I'd love to think that there's something else going on. But there does seem to be a lot of evidence suggesting that is the logic here.
So if we just rewind the clock for a bit, Neil, you've spoken in the past saying historically there have been many instances of the West's failure to take Russians seriously and to cultivate the country, that was the term you used, after the breakup of the Soviet Union. You said that we underestimate Russian pride and should have anticipated the return of Russia, because history shows us that status and influence are very important to Russians. So a lot has changed since 1991 and Gorbachev and Glasnost. What happened? I know it's a long period, but what do we do wrong? I mean, or what should have we done?
Okay, we're talking about the short history of the last 30 years. Okay. Let me think here. Let's be brief. To go to the capstone immediately, I think Western diplomacy radically failed with regard to, and American economic diplomacy radically failed in the 1990s. You know, as George H.W. Bush said, we won the Cold War, it's over. What he didn't take into account is that Russia always comes back. And this was a moment in which I think there was some possibility for integrating Russia into a broader international community of Europe and the United States or whatever, or at least making it moderately benign. But it carried a price. You had to, all of these purported democratizers had an economic crisis on their hands of monumental proportions as a result of the collapse of the Soviet Union. We could have helped them more than we did, but we didn't, because the perception was the Cold War was over. And as a result, the idea of democracy lost weight in Russia, and if you will, the Western economic system also, as a model, also lost weight, and gradually more Eurasianist or nationalist forces in Russia gathered steam when Yevgeny Primakov became foreign minister and then prime minister. It's a good example, and that was in the middle of the Yeltsin period. I'm going too far into the weeds, Mary, so I will move on quickly. But I think we lost an opportunity there, and going on to further errors. I mean, I think I referred to the NATO 2007 Bucharest Declaration, where it said that Georgia and Ukraine would become would become members of NATO at some point, but as conditions change. I refer to this as the stupidest mistake that American diplomacy has made in the last 40 years, because it irritated the Russians deeply. It irritated Putin seriously, and it left them vulnerable because they were not protected by a security guarantee. And so we had Georgia 2008, we had Ukraine in 2014. This war began in 2014, not in 2022. And then we had the full invasion. And, we could have done it differently. There's no point in crying over spilt milk. And let's move on and do what we need to do now.
But as Peter said, one never knows really what mood or what really Putin's doing, even though he's saying something. Like, for example, when he recognized Ukraine as a sovereign state in 91, and then 94 granted them a security guarantee for them giving up their nuclear weapons. That was a long-term strategy. Clearly, that left them extremely vulnerable. So was that a big mistake for Ukraine? Or what do you think, Peter?
Well, if you want my opinion, circumstances change under the circumstances of the time. I remember a Georgian friend of mine who was the foreign minister at the time in Georgia saying that when the president of Ukraine asked Shevardnadze what he thought of the Budapest Memorandum and the surrender of nuclear weapons in Ukraine to, as it happens, Russia, Shevardnadze said, well, maybe you should keep a couple.
Yeah.
Well, they didn't keep a couple, and it was gone. But under the circumstances of the time, I think the Ukrainians viewed the guarantee of the UK, Britain, and Russia to be in good faith. And at the time, it was in good faith. Then Putin comes along, circumstances change, and he ignored it. This is normal life in international relations. Pacts are made to be broken, and this one was broken.
Okay, Peter, what's your take on that?
I think that, relating it to the present, there is a danger that if the world sees America showing such epic weakness, that it'll be a huge encouragement for countries everywhere that may have thought that America offered a security guarantee to start chasing nuclear weapons. I think that is going to be one of the potential consequences of America stopping being a guarantor of security to its friends. So coming back to the nuclear question, the Budapest Memorandum, and again, I'm not a huge expert on the periods, it seems to be at this moment of, an attempt to decrease proliferation. Now its trashing is going to be part of a process of the reverse, because every medium-sized power that is next to a aggressive superpower is going to be thinking, well, what's our lesson here? America is unreliable. We need nukes. And that's going to make for a much more dangerous world.
Absolutely.
So let's go back to what Putin got wrong. We were talking about what the Allies got wrong, or the Western alliance. Has he completely underestimated the extent of the Ukrainian resistance in this and miscalculated?
If are you asking me, Mary?
Yeah.
Okay, fine. Well, Putin, frankly, sort of strategically, as it stands now, his attack on Ukraine was a massive error. because he underestimated the resilience and the fortitude of the Ukrainians themselves. That was the result was the retreat from Kyiv, and then Kharkiv, the area of Kharkiv, and then and Kherson. And this is not what he expected. More broadly, and by the way, he's losing a lot more people than Ukraine is in this war. More broadly, I guess he may have thought that he was halting the expansion of NATO. Mm. Then you get Finland saying, let's go into NATO, and then Sweden. And by the way, that basically turns the Baltic Sea into a NATO lake, because these countries plus Denmark control all of the exits and entries to the Baltic Sea. And both Sweden and Finland are major military powers. And they have the capacity, if Russia attacks the Baltics, to reinforce, and they provide a land bridge for the rest of NATO to reinforce, other than Germany and Poland, which already exist. So, I mean, I think this was just look, frankly, I think that Putin lives in a mythic world. He overestimated his own power. He overestimated the military capacity of Russia. And then we get to this notion that Ukrainians are Russians, which is obviously now clearly wrong, and that NATO is weak and we can just roll them over. Now, that story remains to be told, but I think it was on the face of it a massive mistake.
So let's move on to the upcoming, first before our election. We've got the Russians having their elections next week, which of course I'm sure are going to be a grand display of the usual pomp and circumstance, and opposition now pretty much out of the picture. So Peter, how effective is the old propaganda machine within Russia? Do you sense that most of the population do genuinely follow the government line about the war? Or you said there's a general atmosphere of complacency and greed, and, Muscovites and city dwellers are miles from the theatre of war. Life goes on. They're not contesting being involved in the war as much. In fact, they got paid quite a lot, didn't they? People in the country to join up. They got incentives to join up. So I guess it was a salvation for people in poor parts of the country.
Yeah, actually, just getting to the end of analysing a bunch of sort of economic and discursive data from across Russia, and it's an interesting picture. Obviously, we're talking about a system where people acquiesce or even, rather enjoy being at war. So, but that's not, that's sort of a deeper question about sort of national, sort of history and identity. But if we're talking about sort of on a kind of day-to-day level, it's an interesting picture. So you have these real contrasts economically. There are regions that have done really well. We have big factories that are seeing an economic boom. Others have done very badly, sort of bits of the country next to the border, for example, the EU. So it's actually, there's a new kind of regional polarization going on, which is interesting. In terms of domestic issues, the biggest issues domestically are not directly about the war, but they are tangentially. It's about inflation and about household debt. So because people don't believe in the stability of the currency, because there's an inflation that's being caused by war production, people taking out crazy amounts of household debt. A lot of the domestic propaganda is telling people to stop taking out household debt and how great it is not to have debt, to which people take out more household debt. So, which tells you, what the vulnerabilities of the propaganda are. People will acquiesce or support the war, and there seems to be some interesting sociology that says they actually, enjoy it. Others will say that it's just imitation. Sociologists are having this debate nonstop about Russia at the moment, and each have great methodologies that prove the opposite of what the other one has. But in terms of like dynamics we see on a kind of day-to-day level, no, the Kremlin propaganda, its campaigns kind of last well for a couple of weeks usually, like mobilization campaigns. You can see it online. They kind of manage to get sentiment up for a couple of weeks, then it dips again. So it's not all smooth sailing for them, especially when it comes to issues to do with sort of economic sustainability. So yes, there hasn't been this giant crash that some people thought, but in terms of the economic boom, this atmosphere is more one of a kind of let's have a big party before the ruble goes up in flames. So it's less solid than it looks, and sometimes we fall for the image of things being very, very stable. Just below the surface, there's a rumblings. Now, those rumblings are so far not the rumblings of thunder; they're the rumblings of a upset stomach, shall we say? But this is a very fragile empire with many, many potential vulnerabilities. But at the end of the day, as long as on the big things like arms production, as long as Putin can show the world and show his people that he's winning on these big bets, then he seems pretty secure. But if the West gets its act together and shows it can outspend, outproduce, finally get its economic warfare strategy together, which hasn't happened so far, then maybe Putin stops looking like quite such a victor, and maybe his risk calculation changes and he starts to become more conservative in his belligerence.
So the people that all lined up and went to Navalny's funeral and laid flowers for 3 days, which surprised me because it's brave, and a lot of them didn't have any covers on their faces or anything like that. Now, do you think there's going to be long-term consequences for all those people? Obviously, they're all on camera somewhere, right?
I mean, there are some signs that some of that is starting to happen. And there's a general, what the Russians call a tightening of the screws going on. I think it's very noticeable. Well, firstly, killing Navalny is a sign of something, or however he died, he was under the Kremlin's duty of care. So if it happened, they were aware that there was a risk of it. And firstly, and secondly, even more spectacularly, the arrest of this sort of dual American-Russian, this young woman, a ballerina who donated $50 to a Ukrainian charity. She comes home and gets locked up for it. That could just be like an overzealous official somewhere, but it could also be a sign of telling a lot of people who are still moving backwards and forwards that you've got to choose now. If you're one of these disloyal people, don't even think about coming back. That's a big change, because actually what a lot of people have been doing, especially people with businesses, is sort of shuttling backwards and forwards, kind of like one foot in Riga and one in Moscow. So that's a real sign that things are going to be shutting down. Again, rumors about greater internet censorship. I mean, so far you still have YouTube and a lot of Western platforms in Russia. That will be, there's been a lot of anticipation that might be cracked down on. And there's a question of what are they preparing for? The election itself is a given, but is there something coming afterwards, whether it's a huge mobilization drive or a change in the constitution? What are they planning next? Because usually these tightenings of the screws come before some sort of policy shift. So people at the moment that are looking at the situation are trying to eye up what that's going to be.
Over to you for a moment, Neil, there. Do you think that there's a kind of a Cold War logic returning to Russia since the war?
Thank you. First of all, I'd like to add a couple things to the economic situation described by Peter. The economic growth in Russia is largely produced by investment in the military-industrial sector. It's not about anything else. And in fact, other sectors of the economy are being starved for resources, including social spending and health spending. Now, in terms of public opinion, you're the expert, Peter, but I would think that eventually that will bite if people can't get operations that they need, or if their kids are not getting properly educated. And then, of course, there is this is an unknown to me. There are all of these families of soldiers who are receiving either the mangled or the dead sons who were working in Ukraine, and there is a previous precedent concerning Chechnya, where the mothers played a significant role in causing a pause in that war. So, I mean, I think that I agree with Peter that actually it looks, in terms of public opinion and support for Russia and the election itself, we will see, I think, massive support for Putin on the ballot. What does that mean in terms of what's going on underneath? It's unknown. Anyway, to your question, is this a new Cold War? I apologize for my digression. I'm not sure. I mean, look, there's clearly a deep sense of confrontation between Russia and the West, and but the Cold War, at least in its mature phase, also involved post-1962 significant cooperation to reduce risk. All of those arms control agreements, ultimately the reduction in weapons of mass destruction. That's different. Putin has suspended almost all of the military cooperation agreements with the West, including strategic arms limitation agreements and also conventional arms and deployment agreements. So I think it's different. It may actually be worse. But there's also the global dimension to this. And just as in the Cold War, when the Soviet Union was competing for influence in the Third World with the United States and the West, this is happening now, but it's a slightly different, it has a slightly different flavor. If you look at Russia's relationship with China, Iran, most strongly, but also with many parts of the global South, they are, to my mind, pretty clearly trying to create an alternative international order, which is a challenge to the liberal order that we claim to manifest ourselves. And that could be, I think, really significant. I don't think it'll work, but who knows? The future is a different country.
Well, heading now towards the relationship that we've got and our emulation or adoration of Trump for Putin, which is clear, it's embarrassing. I think surely Russians are in some ways laughing at the state of things in the United States right now. I mean, we've got ridiculous courts that can't seem to do anything about Trump. We've got gridlock in our democratic process. And then we've got people, bending over backwards, like you mentioned, Viktor Orban, coming to, The Guardian described it, the autocrat in exile in Palm Beach, which I loved it. They didn't actually talk about Trump by name. And he gushed about him being a strong man and a real boss. That's what Trump described him as, which is kind of the gangster language we've come to expect from Trump. But he poses a huge threat to the NATO alliance if he gets elected. So what's your feeling about that? And why is it the American people don't seem to be concerned about Europe? The implications and the repercussions will affect us. And why do they feel so buffered from what's going on in Ukraine and therefore everywhere else in Europe connected? So who wants to take that?
I don't know. I've been reviewing a whole bunch of sort of sociology that was being done here in the US around the topic of sort of American involvement in the world and all that kind of stuff. And what was really striking was sort of lots and lots of in-depth interviews with Americans, which can be even more interesting than focus groups because you really start to see the patterns between what people say, which haven't been forced. And something that really came out for a lot of people was the lack of a connection between American prosperity and happiness and its connections to the outside world. So I don't have anything to compare things to, but I'd always imagined that Americans at least used to enjoy the Pax Americana. The idea of being invested in global security was connected to the idea of American success, prosperity, both psychologically, it was pleasant, but also economically. That's completely broken down. Even the people who still want to do good in the world, because they have a sense of America's mission, and there are lots of people like that, they have zero connection between that and it's good for America. They just have a sense that we should because we're America and we're the good guys. For many more, the outside world is simply a place that wants to parasite on America, that is dangerous, that you need to hide away from, especially young people. When they hear anything foreign policy, they just want to hide. Their instinct is like, hide. And for older ones, it's the sense that everybody's leeching on us and that our entanglements actually make us poorer. Globalization has made us poorer. The companies who do well out of it do it for themselves and not for us. And there's just this sense that the outside world is something that makes us poorer and weaker. And we can explore the roots of that psychologically, psychoanalytically, if you want, but also kind of just in terms of recent history. And I think America is almost waiting for somebody who can really make people feel and think that it's good for America to be invested in a more stable world. But that connection is gone. I mean, it is not there anymore. And that was quite stunning. I didn't realize that it had gone to such an extent. Simply because I grew up in Europe, where we'd always assumed that, quite the opposite. There's the opposite narrative there, that America dominates the world in order to become rich, that America is making money from profit and power from globalization. And that's sort of the narrative we grew up with. And then you go back to America and they think the absolute opposite. That it's there to leech off America. Someone has to start reforging those connections. And I mean, I think media needs to do a much better job. Because even sort of benign humanitarian Democrats don't see the connection, let alone MAGA voters. So something's gone. People's vision of the world doesn't make those connections anymore between American power and American prosperity.
Can I pick that one up, Mary? I basically agree with everything that Peter has said, except that I would add one thing. I mean, if you asked a representative sample of Americans what country Orban was the prime minister of, you'd probably get 10% correct and 90% don't know. It reminds me of a poll in the 1980s. We haven't changed much, or I should say America hasn't changed much. This was a poll about Nicaragua and American support for the Contras. And the poll question was, is America supporting the government of Nicaragua? And I believe it was 54% of the population said yes, because we always support governments. I mean, which was quite wrong. So I think that America is a very big place, and a lot of its population don't think very much about foreign affairs. Now, as for leeching from America, I think that is a very clear problem. But I think this is changing, and this might be one of the, again, being optimistic, Mary, this might be another positive spin-off of this debate in the United States. I think the European countries, certainly Germany, France, Britain, if Britain is in Europe, and the Netherlands and the Low Countries and so on and so forth, and Norway and Sweden, are very clear that there is doubt about the future of the American commitment to European security for domestic political reasons. And so they are investing more in their own defense. So one of the long-term consequences of this might actually well be an integrated and capable European defense structure, which, would be a good thing, not least because the Europeans have been leeching off the United States defense establishment for decades. The United States spends well beyond NATO spending targets for defense spending. And the majority of European countries, like my home country, Canada, are basically taking the protection without paying the price. Mm-hmm. And I think this crisis and also the American ambivalence about underwriting it has its effect in Europe and in NATO as a whole.
I just wanted to move on to this comparison between Putin and Trump, what similarities and differences they have. Peter, you made an animated film for the BBC, and in it you said Trump and Putin share a disdain for the facts, and that's part of their appeal. Well, my question, first of all, is to whom? And Trump worships Putin, but I don't think it's a mutual relationship. So regardless of that, I'd still think the liaison is a dangerous one. So what would you have to say about that? Disdain for the facts, part of their appeal.
Yeah, my word, that was so many years ago. Thank you for finding that.
Picking it up.
I did that one, 16, 17. And we're still, and these topics are still relevant. They're more than, there's a pattern here. Look, I'm not the first person to remark that authoritarians' disregard for the truth can be part of their appeal. I mean, it's a relief from the glum constraints of reality. Maybe at some level, it's some sort of promise of immortality, because the biggest reality out there is death. So there is a pleasure in rejecting facts. Maybe it's sort of weird that we ever even looked to politicians who gave us the facts, especially when the facts tell you unpleasant things. That you're getting older, that your country's getting not as successful, and so on. So there's something about that disregard for reality which can make them, gives them a kind of almost punk-like, anarchic energy. So, but it's also deeply dangerous, because if there's something very disconcerting when facts are thrown out the window, it's very hard to form any kind of resistance, because usually we need truth to resist. Very hard to sort of base any arguments, because you realize any arguments you make are hopeless. It also signals their disregard for institutions, which is something that Russians have been conditioned to assume as normal, and something Americans are only starting to discover is much more tenuous than they thought.
Quick word from you, Neil.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think on Putin and Trump, I think it's sort of like Orban in a funny sort of way. I mean, Orban, he reminds me of I think it was what is it, Ben and Jerry cartoon of years and years ago. I'm older.
Tom and Jerry.
Tom and Jerry. And I'm older than everybody here, so I'm allowed to refer to this, where the mouse was offered a piece of cheese in front of his hole, and the mouse ran out, picked up the cheese, and ran back into his hole. This is Orban. No offense to Hungary, by the way. But, he basically, he resisted EU assistance to Ukraine until he got $10 billion in side payment, part of the European support structure for Ukraine, which had been denied because of his violations of rule of law and democracy considerations. And then he started delaying Sweden's accession to NATO. And what did he get for that? The Swedes sold him some airplanes. I mean, or probably gave them to him. I have no idea, but it's he is in the NATO structure a minor player, and if it becomes important to NATO, a deal is always cut that shuts him up. Okay. Now, as for Trump, I think Trump likes what Putin does. I don't know whether he likes Putin particularly. He may not like anybody particularly. But, Putin is what Trump wants to be, an authoritarian who controls the government. Putin, on the other hand, my guess would be, Peter could comment more effectively on this than I am. I think Putin believes Trump to be a useful idiot. You play him and he does things that you like. And certainly Trump is, from what he says, although we have no idea what Trump would actually do if he were elected, and I don't believe he will be elected, but leaving that aside, Trump would do things that Putin wanted him to do. And what's wrong with that from Putin's perspective? I don't think Putin has an ounce of respect for Trump, but he's a useful idiot.
So propaganda, Peter, is your thing. We've got a serious problem now with the coming election, and one wonders how much more effective Russia will be the second time round with the bots shaping the outcome. BBC just brought in this thing called Verify. I don't know if you've seen it in the last couple of weeks, where they try and tell you whether something is true or not. If a video is posted, they say we verified it, which is how they found out yesterday that Kate's photoshopped picture for Mother's Day or whatever was because of Verify. But is it enough? And it still doesn't make up for the big problem, which is the bulk of the masses are not watching the BBC. They're doing Instagram and Fox on their phone. So how do we counter the fact that they're banging on and on and on about the age of Biden? And there's only, 3 years between him and Trump? I mean, there really isn't a great deal. And at least when Biden's doing something, all the lights are on, which you can't say the same for Trump. But that's never made any use of in the media. So I don't want to presume, but what's the answer? What's some of the answer to that with the presses that we have, the media that we have?
Well, look, I'm a Brit and I've only been in America a couple of years. And frankly, I spend a lot of my time thinking about Ukraine. So I'm very cautious to make any kind of like sweeping generalizations, but I'm kind of a journalist, so I will. I've been kind of surprised since moving to America. There seems to be so much talk of like, how does one, essentially do a long-term cultural media effort, not just an election one, but a long-term one to put it very simply, to sort of like break off some of the sort of more right-wing community. It's fairly standard in many countries to have sort of 15% of people who are virulently, I don't want to use the word, I don't want to use the F word, but, inclined towards Fism. But we see it in many countries. 15% of people vote for far-right parties. But to break that off and then try to integrate at least some of those people into a broader public sphere. And I know it's very easy to laugh at the BBC in Britain, and it makes so many mistakes, and it's constantly in crisis. But after Brexit, they radically moved a huge amount of their staff, newsrooms, to what's rather idiotically known as the north of England, which is most of the country. But it was the right idea because it had become too London-centric. That was true. And they made up for a mistake. And no one does that in America. I mean, it would be the equivalent of like CNN moving, half its newsroom to flyover states. But no one does it in America. When people try to overcome polarization, they do it in the worst possible way, which is why by platforming Trump's lies. That's not what it means. It means undercutting the politicians to reach the audiences. But somebody has to do that. We know how to do it. It's not that. I mean, I've just written a book about how the British managed to get Germans to listen to their radio content by making it about the lives of ordinary Germans and showing them how the Nazis were making them miserable. I mean, they were doing that and winning audiences of, huge audiences in Germany during the war and breaking through the polarization during a real war, let alone a culture war. So it can be done. I mean, it can be hit and miss, but you have to want to do it. And I've sort of been surprised. I mean, since 8 years now, people in America have been talking about this problem. And I haven't seen one massive cultural communications initiative to do anything about it. If anything, institutions, well, sadly, like the New York Times, have decided to double down on the polarization because it leads to easier profit. There's now been several people who've talked about this. It's also a profit model and increasing polarization. So I'm a bit confused. I mean, there's a complete recognition from the expert community that something needs to be done, that somebody needs to be integrating diverse audiences into a shared understanding of reality. But no one wants to do it. And then we're surprised when so much of the country still seems to be living in a different place. Now the election has started, and Biden is doing this. Biden is clearly trying to say, hey, Haley Democrats, come to me, or hey, people over here, you don't want to be with the crazy people, come to me. But that's an election, and that's PR and tactics, which will stop the moment the election's over. What we really need is a project that helps integrate the nation. And I think in America, this is particularly dangerous because America has always been a country of incredibly diverse people with not that much in common. And so that common, well, we use the term public sphere, is even more important in America than it weirdly is someone like England, which has so many other ways of fusing the nation. Because, it's or let alone a country, like we've talked about Poland, which is now so, very, very has ways of surviving the polarization that it is going through as well. But in America, it's particularly dangerous. I mean, America has always been founded on the ability to integrate very, very different people. And somebody needs to be doing that. And I just don't see any force in America that's doing it. I mean, I maybe I'm misdiagnosing something, maybe I'm missing something, but it seems like this extraordinary act of self-harm.
Well put. Well put. Well, we're running out of time. I hate to tell you, we've got very few minutes left, but I'm going to run over a little bit because there are a couple of things that we didn't. There's two things. One is that you said to me, Peter, the West is all over and Russia and China are in the ascendancy. I don't know if you remember saying that. But again, is this all show, this Russia-China no limits friendship? And won't the new dynamic globally be dictated by nations' access to energy and armaments? They're the two things, right?
I was talking about if the election is lost, or if Trump wins the election and does what he's threatening to do, then it will be a huge victory.
And this new alignment you mentioned between Russia and China.
No, I think my co-panelists really had it very well. It's not quite the Cold War. We always look for analogies from the past. It's going to be different because there's so many codependencies in economics, in so many in technology, that I don't think we'll have two clear blocks. Like here's the sort of, the Western bloc and here's the other bloc. I don't think it's going to be that. It's still going to be very networked, but it's going to be kind of, countries and superpowers in bed with each other and stabbing each other at the same time. And we're going to see a much darker vision of globalization when we're both interconnected and incredibly and weaponizing that all the time. And it's going to be a very turbulent period. And I think he will win who can manage those networks better, which is why, again, the Trump path is a dangerous path. I mean, what you're going to need, the only way we deal with this challenge is if the democracies and other interested countries hang together. And you see the reaction from Japan, Taiwan, Australia to a war in Ukraine, which really doesn't affect them personally. They get it. They understand what happens here will influence them. Japan is now, I think, the biggest donor of Ukrainian reconstruction. Don't quote me on that, but it's spectacular and very quietly, not doing it for show. But when you go to Kiev, they're like, oh my God, the Japanese are the most effective actors at the moment. They don't do military aid for obvious reasons, but in the other types. If the democracies aren't going to hang together, I think we're in for a very bad time. And it's not going to be clean, as in like it's going to be democracies and not democracies at all. There's going to be horrible compromises. But I think in this world, he who has the most effective networks is going to win. That sounds haughty. I'm talking about things like supply chains. Right at the moment, there is a case to be made that we don't understand our supply chains in the military space, but also like in the toothbrush space. I'm not sure we know where our bits for our toothbrushes come from. I've got a very fancy toothbrush, as you can tell. That probably has to change. We probably do have to start ensuring that our supply chains, especially in the security space, especially with what's known as dual use technology, are friendshored. That's a phrase Janet Yellen used. Because America can't actually produce everything itself. It is going to have to get its microchips from somewhere else. What is the security of that place? How do we make sure that China or Russia can't mess with that? And by the way, they're doing exactly the same thing. They worked out, China is rapidly, understanding the game too. So I think we're going to see that, and there are going to be countries that are going to be left horribly exposed, and they're going to be in all sorts of trouble. And I think we'll see all sorts of like little security deals happening. If America is no longer the guarantor, and it currently isn't the guarantor anyway for lots of places, we're going to see lots of tactical security arrangements to kind of like shore up something in a particular network. So I think that's where we're headed to. It's not going to be quite the Cold War, but it's going to be like the Cold War in terms of allies and friendships are critical because we are dependent on each other. And that's another reason why the Trump kind of throw your friends over the bus. Is that a phrase for over the boat? Oh my God.
Under the bus.
Under
the bus and over the boat is so damaging to America. So another reason I really hope it doesn't happen.
Last word from you, Neil. And we didn't talk about the nuclear threat either.
Oh, well, if you want me to talk about that, we'll have to do it another day.
Yeah,
I think following on what Peter said, one thing we're going to, whether we like it or not, and whatever we do, is we are going towards a multipolar world. U.S. unipolarity is finishing. There will be multiple powerful actors who will compete or cooperate as it suits them. And this is a different place than it was during the Cold War, when it was either for us or against us, and punishment was delivered accordingly. On Russia, China, I think just looking at the past 500 years of Russian-Chinese history, I think this is doomed. What's happening now is that China is taking advantage of Russia's isolation in order to increase its influence over Russia economically, in terms of revenue accruing to Russia, and in terms of stripping Russian resources. Now, this, given Russia's nationalism, which is again also very old, and its exclusivity to others, I think this will evoke eventually a reaction in Russia, which will cause Russia to look elsewhere to compensate for its vulnerability to China. And I expect that one area where we may be seeing this already is Central Asia, where Russia has traditionally been dominant there, and now most of the trading and investment activity is done by China in Central Asia rather than Russia. And Russia's not going to like that. And the relationship so far has been calm in Central Asia. But, the deeper Chinese incursions into Russia and also into Russia's, if you will, minions goes, the more Russians will become disturbed by it. So I'm again, I don't know whether that's optimism or pessimism, but I think that's what will likely happen in the medium term with the Russia-China relationship. And also, final point, China's current influence over Russia is effectively driven by the war in Ukraine and Russia's isolation. If the war in the Ukraine ends one way or another, that relationship of dependence, Russian dependence on China, diminishes. And there's no love lost between the Russians and the Chinese.
Okay, well, I hope your optimism comes to fruition for both of you, and money does go into Ukraine and keeps the dynamic and NATO build up, which I think has been a good thing that's happened, because it's given them a bit of a reality check. This could happen, and it could happen again. What was it somebody put in the chat box here? Putin's comment to Tucker Carlson about Poland being to blame for World War II because they didn't agree to Hitler's demand for a Danzig corridor.
That is ridiculous.
Yeah. Well, we've run over. I would love to keep talking, but they're going to pull the plug on me at GBH. I want to thank you so much. You've been so wonderfully informative and great analysis of a very complicated topic. So Neil McFarlane, thank you, and Peter Pomerantsev. Hope I got the name right the second time. Thank you for your time. Appreciate it and insight.
And thank you.
Cambridge Forum is made possible by the generosity of Herbert and Dorothy Vetter, the Lowell Institute, the Mass Cultural Council, and of course you. So don't forget to cough up. If you want to sign up, go to the website www.cambridgeforum.org, where you can receive all our e-newsletters. We produce weekly broadcasts of Cambridge Forum, and a video of today's program will be uploaded to YouTube shortly, thanks to GBH Forum Network, our wonderful partners. Thank you, everybody, for joining us today. I look forward to seeing you all in 2 weeks. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye.